Hello, and welcome to the Sacred Heart Shaman Podcast, where we talk about spiritual healing, shamanic wisdom, and the challenges of walking the healer's path. My name is Nadia Harenkiu, and today is episode number 15, A Shamanic Perspective on Medication. Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the podcast today. We are talking about medication. So before I say anything else, I want to be very clear and share that I am not a medical professional in any way. Please do not take this as medical advice. Simply here to share how I see medication interacting with the spirit world as well as the human body or the spirit side of the human body. I also want to say there is zero shame around medication. I am going to discuss several different facets of medication today, from psychiatric to medical conditions in general and what they mean, to interactions in the plant medicine space. And I do want to be clear that I am not giving advice, and I am also not trying to shame anybody about medication. So in today's world, the collective is very hard right now. It's very dense, it's very challenging, and I do see a lot of need for medication. I work with people with a variety of conditions, and I see the necessity, and I also see the way it hinders our healing. So we're going to talk about it. So acceptance around the necessity in our current 3D paradigm is important. I think there are a lot of times where we do need medication in order to get through a certain period because we do not have the other supports necessary to get through without it, such as community, spiritual support, adequate mental health support, and so on. So the medication topic comes up a lot in my work, and I learned about what it looks like in the spirit world, what it's good for, and where it can hold us back from moving forward. In general, it is my personal belief that medication should be temporary. I'm going to explain how I see medication in the spirit world, and hopefully that will give a better indicator of why I have this belief. So I see medication a lot of times as scaffolding that is holding up a dilapidated house. Now, there are many times in our life where things need to die or fall away, and we are not prepared to let them die. And the scaffolding helps us keep them up until we are ready to let them go. This being said, there are many ways we can approach death. I do actually plan on doing an entirely separate podcast around this topic because it's not something that we do very well in our society. And so when I see medication, especially psychiatric medication in the spirit world, it often looks like holding something up that needs to come down for whatever reason. And we may not be ready for things to come down because we don't have the physical support, the emotional support, the financial support. And so we need medication to keep us pulling through until we can get to the point where we can let it fall down. Now, this can go pretty deep in topic, as you can imagine, but that's kind of like a black and white how I see medication show up a lot, especially psychiatrically. So when I do find medication appropriate is when you can't function, when you are so deep in struggle that you can't do day-to-day things or your body can't perform necessary functions. This can be like on a daily basis, long-term medication. It can also be things like Xanax for panic attacks. You need the scaffolding for whatever reason. This is what you need right now, and you should give yourself permission. Sometimes we simply need more support than what we have in the immediate sense, and once we get through a certain piece of it, we can take that support away and support ourselves. So first I'm going to talk specifically about psychiatric medication as it pertains to shamanic healing and kind of the dangers involved with medication use from a spiritual standpoint. So medication can encourage the splitting of the personality and closing off certain shadow aspects. When we close off our shadow or we close off parts of ourselves, they do get bigger, they do get stronger. Sometimes they even separate themselves from us, and they become this like thing that follows us around, more like a golem than actually part of us. And medication does this because a lot of times medication's used to numb something undesirable, right? If we have anxiety, we just want it to go away so that we can survive, but we're not really actively looking at what's causing the anxiety, because anxiety is a symptom of something greater. So if I take a medication to stop my anxiety or to get rid of it, whatever part of me is bringing that anxiety forward, I'm effectively telling it to stop bringing it forward, telling it that I don't want to listen to it, and I'm shoving it in a closet. Now, again, this is okay for a time, but when it comes to long-term healing, we will experience the unresolved thing that we were trying to numb. And that goes for, many different symptoms that we're trying to fix or dull or get rid of in our culture. So essentially, when we're numbing things that need to be felt, we are dealing with shadow work. We're dealing with parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at or we can't look at, and so we numb it. And this can be done with alcohol and TV and sex and other addictions. It can also be done with medication. I have yet to see anybody in the spirit world or like in a shamanic healing capacity where there just wasn't something right with them. Um, like this idea that, oh, our brain chemicals are just off or our genetics are just off. I actually have yet to encounter that. So that's interesting. More on that later. Um, and then when we avoid things that we're feeling through this process, that's actually how we create entities. So I'll kind of give you an example. If I'm taking a medication for weight loss, I am not dealing with the underlying reason why I'm over-consuming or binging or unable to eat things that are good for my body. So I'm taking medication to stop the symptom, and then because I'm not looking at it, I'm subconsciously throwing energy at it. And that's how we create entities. And those are basically like large clusters of energy that follow us around, that are attached to us, that we have created. Um, Unpopular belief, you can't remove entities. They will just come right back because we're creating them, we're feeding them. And by avoiding our emotions, we do often create entities, and medication assists in that process. Additionally, medication can prevent you from going deeper into your healing work, as in most cases, it's masking something. So, this is fine. You can get a lot done until you're ready to come off medication. But when it comes to shamanic work, it's about going as deep as possible into yourself, into your past, into your trauma, doing that kind of darker, denser work on yourself, the deeper healing work. And when there's medication involved, there will always be a wall. We will always hit a point of no return. And shamanically, I see that as literal walls. Sometimes it looks like fog or locked doors. Sometimes it looks like a lens that when you see through it, everything is dark on the other side or like dimmed in some way. That is the medication kind of creating a wall between you and this thing that you don't want to look at, that you don't want to deal with. So there's always only so deep that we can go in the process when there is the energy of a medication present. Now, remember that you don't have to do all of the things in one lifetime. So maybe there's something that you're unable to look at, and this is not the lifetime to look at it. Like, okay, cool. Like, we don't have to push through that or over that. We don't have to take down this wall. It's not necessary. But if you have any part of you that is feeling like you need to go deeper, but you're unable to, this is why I'm saying medication does prevent you from going deeper. And intuitively, you're going to know that. You're going to feel like, oh, I just can't get to the bottom of this thing. I feel like I need to go deeper. I feel like I need something else. A lot of times it's the medication that kind of puts up that it's a ceiling almost. We can only go so far with it. So I'm going to give some real life examples and wisdom from my work around all different types of medications and even some conditions that we medicate for. And I'll give you a shamanic lens to view it, and You can take it or leave it, depending on how it lands inside you. I am simply here to share. So, although these things that I'm going to talk about are pretty consistent among people I work with, a few of them do vary. If you are struggling personally with any of these things or it doesn't resonate with you, highly recommend doing like a shamanic session to do a full reading of whatever is going on. Or if there's something I don't mention, you're like, oh, I would love to know the spiritual side of this. In most cases, the spiritual side of medical conditions are very complex, and it's not as simple as saying, I have this issue, I want it resolved. And that issue may be number 15 down a list of things that need to be resolved first in order for it to be resolved in itself. So, for example, addiction is very complicated, pain is very complicated, eating disorders are very complicated, depression, anxiety. It's not cut and dry. It's like a culmination of many, many, many things and many layers, and things need to be completed in a sequence in order to unlock them. Um, anyway, so we're going to start with that. First and foremost, very little that I have encountered is strictly chemical imbalance or genetic from a spiritual standpoint. I am going to say that I don't see every person. You know, my client pool is in the thousands, it's not in the millions. But from my experience as a practitioner, less than 1% is due to some kind of chemical imbalance or genetic conditions. And when we talk about genetic conditions, we need to be talking about ancestral trauma, because if you have something that like your mother had and your grandmother had, it's coming down the line waiting to be healed. And we can actually address that in shamanic healing through ancestral work. Ancestral Medicine is a fantastic book if you want to look into that more deeply. You know, so I see this a lot with like breast cancer that goes down the line, or some kind of mental illness. Men who have like heart conditions, strokes, high blood pressure that they say they got from their dad. Like, it doesn't work that way. It's more like personality, conditioning, trauma that gets passed down generation to generation. And there is ancestral trauma that can impact almost every category of your life, um, and show up as like spiritual illness, emotional, physical. It's really interesting. In terms of a chemical imbalance, very, very, very few cases I have encountered where someone is just like, this is the way they are. There's nothing we can do about it. In most cases, the spirits will say, well, yeah, it's actually their diet, or it's actually this, or actually that, and what they need is very unique, and they're not getting it, and therefore it's causing an imbalance. So the idea that like we can take a medication that will correct an imbalance, I actually think is kind of a short term or a band-aid effect to the deeper spiritual healing that can take place. If you have trouble sleeping, there is typically something really buried in your subconscious that needs to be addressed. So people who have really bad insomnia, a lot of times what I see is a child who's like holding his eyes open and he's like, I don't want to go to bed because I'm scared. So there's typically safety issues. There's an underlying sense of like, I can't look at this because it's not safe. And so there's a fight to go to that deeper subconscious place that we go to when we're sleeping during some dream states. There are many different types of dream states, and a few of them are quite shamanic. I will talk about dreams in a different podcast as well. Anxiety. So anxiety is very complicated. Um, that's why it's so funny, this idea that it's just a thing that can be treated or fixed. Anxiety is super, super multifaceted, and a lot of times it's actually excitement that has no outlet, because we're not really taught to be excited ever in any part of our life. It's also really closely tied to control and surrender. So the inability to surrender to the universe or the unknown. And spiritual work really helps with this, because that's about developing a relationship with the universe. And the more relationship we have with the universe, the more trust we have, and the easier ability we have to surrender. And we can trust that we're going to be okay. We're going to trust that we can be taken care of. And in that trust, actually less bad stuff happens because we have that trust. And anxiety does alleviate. So anxiety is super interesting. It's also very intellectual at times. It really depends on the person, though. Every person's different when it comes to the pathway to resolve severe anxiety. OCD is like small level looping, and loops are energy that need to be broken. They need to be dismantled, and new thoughts and processes need to be put in their place. And again, very spiritual process. Most people who have severe mental issues actually have psychic abilities that they need to be shown how to use in conjunction with their healing process. They also often have the worst trauma, and so that makes it hard to stabilize enough to explore their gifts. And this is the way of the healer, right? The people who are out there doing the healing work a lot of time, or supposed to be doing the healing work, especially on the shamanic path, have a significant amount of trauma. And so when they do their trauma healing, it needs to be done in conjunction with shamanic healing, because you have to be understanding your gifts and abilities at the same time in order to heal in a way that will stick. So if I, for example, would go to a certain kind of therapist for issues that I had, but they didn't believe in highly sensitive people, or they didn't believe in mediums or psychics, and I told them about what I was experiencing, they would legitimately think I was crazy. I know that I'm not at this point in time, but I never had that support when I was younger. And it is actually essential to have, if not a highly spiritual therapist, to have some kind of shaman or spiritual person in addition to therapy while you're going through your process. With this kind of severity, it's also best done slowly with like a gentle healer. So a very feminine approach versus what I think a lot of people take is the more harsh, like you just need self-discipline kind of approach. Um, Birth control severely interferes with the womb function on a spiritual level. So if your body is not doing what you hope it would do, there is a reason for that. It's trying to tell you something that we aren't listening to. And this is a universal rule about the body. So if your cycle is out, if it's extremely painful, if you have cysts or endometriosis, I have been diagnosed with endometriosis and cervical cancer and all sorts of other things. That's womb work. It's womb healing. And that can be done shamanically as well. So there's a lot of things that we carry there as females, biological females. We have a portal built into our body, and that portal requires certain care. It requires certain awareness. When things are not working the way that they need to work, or we want them to work, or in a way that's comfortable, there is information that's trying to come through. Typically, it has to do with ancestral trauma. There's a lot of female sexual trauma in the generations just before mine, and we all carry it. And so it's a process of just moving through it, clearing it, acknowledging it, and then honoring our body. We are so quick in our society to just like plug it up and shut it up and move on with our day, when really there's an honoring process that needs to happen. Like this shedding and this death that happens every month, we need to be honoring it. We need to be being gentle with ourselves. We need to stop trying to plug it. Like, what are we telling our body, right? If your body, if you can imagine your body like a 3-year-old and you're like, I just don't want you to do that. I need you to shut up. I need you to stop. I have to focus on doing this other stuff today. That child would be traumatized. They would feel so wounded. They would be really hurt. They would think you didn't love them. And that's basically what we tell our womb when we're telling it to be different. So, something to chew on. And this is not just the womb, it's the entire body. Whenever our body is trying to tell us something and we tell it to stop, we are effectively telling the body that it's not what we want it to be, and therefore we won't listen to it. You can imagine the implications with that. Blood pressure is unprocessed rage. I do find that a lot of people, if they go through the rage work, sacred rage work or ceremony work to process out their rage, their blood pressure does go down. So it is not a lifelong condition if you do work on the rage. Bad breath is often something related to festering. So if you have things that you need to express that you are holding back and you hold them back for so long, they actually begin to fester in your body and you can smell them. So this is not all bad breath. It's actually very specific. It smells very, and I actually don't know if I'm the only one who can smell it or if other people can smell it too, but it's very putrid. Um, it's not like halitosis, kind of like dry mouth or like weird bad breath stuff. It's like, I don't know, different. And it means that there's something festering inside you. I do believe it leads to other things like stomach cancer. Depression and suicidal ideation is very, very much linked to shame and self expression, as well as being stuck somewhere that is not here and is not you. So, in working with shame a lot, I have come to see that it is one of the primary drivers of suicidal ideation. Um, and yeah, I think that is the key to work through the suicide stuff. Um, and depression is we're going to separate depression and suicide. So, suicide, I feel, is very, very linked to shame and self expression. Depression is very much linked to being stuck in the past, but often those two things are linked together for whatever reason. There are many interesting and unexpected medications that influence mushroom work that technically should not. So, in my work with psilocybin ceremony, I did find a lot of people would report various issues with certain medications, or I would witness certain issues with medications in their body in real time that were not on any studies, that were not on any documentation. And so I started making recommendations that were based off of observation. Really, really interesting things. And it makes me wonder, like these things that we take for heartburn, how it affects our digestion, how it's affecting our body. It's really fascinating. Completely cuts out the effects of mushrooms for some people. There are certain types of psychiatric medications that are supposed to be fine that cause splitting and psychosis, and absolutely nothing to happen physically, but on a spiritual level, like terrible things. Really, really concerning, actually. I wish I could do studies on it, but nobody wants to fund shamanic studies, so that's a thing. You will notice that the deeper you go into spirituality, the less your body will tolerate any kind of medication. For me, when I was younger, in my early 20s, I had tried every medication under the sun. I was diagnosed with borderline and depression, anxiety, probably an eating disorder at some point, bipolar at some point, all of the things. I tried all the medications. And the only one that ever worked for me was Adderall. And it was because I had undiagnosed ADD, allegedly. Um, but I couldn't even take the extended release. I had to take the highly addictive one, right? And that worked out really well for me until I had a baby and I had to come off, and then life happened. When I tried to circle back to Adderall, I had previously left it at the highest dosage possible. I kept needing to go up in order for it to work. And then when I circled back in my 30s, because I was having a hard time and I thought, okay, this worked previously, I'm going to go back to it. I could not take a quarter of the smallest dose. So I think I was at like 120 milligrams 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And then when I tried to come back in my early 30s, I couldn't take a fraction of 5 milligrams because it felt like my body had been torched by lightning. I couldn't sleep for 3 or 4 days. The teeth grinding was so bad that I started chipping my teeth. Um, the level of sensitivity just went from like 0 to 100 as I continued to go down the spiritual path. And that's a thing. You have to be a lot more careful with what you put in your body. It's going to impact you differently. And a lot of times your body is going to say, screw you, I don't need medication. We need to look at this problem, or we need to look at this symptom, or we need to look at what our body is telling us instead of trying to dull it. So that shifts for a lot of people when they're on the spiritual path, and that's totally normal. The last piece I want to talk about is pain and addiction. So I personally do not have experience with chronic pain. I've experienced pain as a portal in like severe cases, like gallbladder attacks. I've had numerous shamanic illnesses that were really intense and really painful, causing like hallucination and kind of wavering between the worlds because the pain was so intense. But the long-term chronic pain is something I still try to wrap my head around. I don't have a lot of clients who deal with it, but I have not gotten a clear answer from the spirits about it yet. And the way that my job works is typically I don't get answers until I experience it myself. Now, in terms of addiction, also very complicated and multifaceted. There is a lot of energy here and a lot of lessons and a lot of like shadow work pieces that come with addiction. I do work a lot with it personally and professionally, and I do find that in most cases, addiction is not something you can just pull or heal. It's a spiral that we need to go through until we're done going through it. And we can be done faster if we have proper support and perspective and the ability to go through it consciously instead of unconsciously. So those two things, the pain and addiction, are not super cut and dry, but I did want to kind of mention them. I also had an interesting experience with cancer on several occasions. I have had several clients with cancer, and it's interesting because either it's something that can be healed or it's not. And that is clear right off the bat of like, yeah, actually, this lesson is for the people around you. You're going to die. You signed up for that. And any prolonging is going to create suffering for you. And then there are the people who have cancer and the fight is inevitable. The going through the process, the extracting it or eradicating it, moving through the conscious death, only to come out on the other side as a new person. Cancer can often be seen in the auras before it lands in the body. I can frequently see it in people, like I can see it's 3 layers up or it's 4 layers up. Did you create this? Was it handed to you by somebody else? I rarely find that it can be removed unless the person themselves identifies the source and removes it energetically or spiritually. That can happen in real life. It can also happen in medicine ceremony. But cancer is also not cut and dry. It's very, very interesting. So I feel like I kind of went a little bit all over the place here. We started talking about medication, and then we went into medical conditions. A lot of my job is medical mediumship type stuff, right? So people see me when they have gone everywhere else and they haven't gotten the answers that they needed. And at that point, they're open to the weird stuff that we talk about together and the very open-minded concepts that I bring to the table. And so my perspective on medication as well as illness is very different from other people. Maybe you find it helpful and maybe you think I'm crazy, and either way, it doesn't matter. I'm here to share what I know and what I see, and I know it'll land for somebody or I wouldn't be called to share it. So I'm here if you have questions, if you want to talk about this. I do medical medium type sessions only in person. For some reason, those gifts do not come well remotely, but you never know. Well, thank you for joining me today on this ramble. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to know more about me and my work, you can find me at www.sacredheartshaman.com.